I haven't been sleeping well. That's how this started. Not with anything dramatic, not with a noise outside or a feeling I couldn't name. Just a July heatwave, a window unit that died on a Thursday, and me lying on top of the sheets at 2 in the morning counting the seconds between ceiling fan rotations. My wife was visiting her mother in Portland. The dog was at the foot of the bed, panting. I'd been awake since midnight, when the bedroom crossed 90 degrees, and somewhere around 2 I remembered we had a box fan in the garage from the old house. I didn't think twice about going to get it. That's the part I want to be clear about. Nothing felt wrong. I was just a sweaty man in his 40s looking for a fan. The garage was only slightly cooler. I found the fan where I thought it would be, wedged between the rock salt and a snowblower we've never actually needed. I pulled it free, and it knocked over a cardboard box from the shelf behind it, and the box hit the floor and split open at one corner, and I saw my mother's handwriting on the side. "Mom's summer stuff!" She passed 3 years ago. I'd been through most of her belongings. Some things somehow made it to our garage without me ever opening them. I'd been meaning to. It was 2:30 in the morning, and I had work at 8, and I sat down on the concrete floor anyway and pulled the flaps open. Most of it was what you'd expect: a crocheted beach cover-up, a tube of sunscreen so old it had separated into 2 distinct layers, 3 paperback novels with cracked spines, a sand dollar wrapped in a paper towel. At the bottom of the box, a manila envelope, thick with photographs, labeled in my mother's neat handwriting. Camp Wendell, 1993. I was 9 that summer. My parents sent me to a 6-week sleepaway camp in the Catskills. Swimming, archery, campfire sing-alongs, the whole catalog. I remembered it as a good summer. One of those uncomplicated childhood memories you keep around like a smooth stone in a coat pocket, taken out sometimes just to feel the weight of it. I spread the photos on the garage floor. Group shots by the lake, a skit night where I was apparently a very committed Viking, a candid of me and my best friend that summer, Danny Harriet, making faces at someone's disposable camera. I was smiling in almost every single one of them. And then I noticed the man. He was in the background of a group shot by the dining hall. Just a figure, partially behind another camper, face turned slightly away. Middle-aged, light-colored shirt. I assumed he was a counselor I didn't remember and moved on. He was in the next photo too, further back this time, near the tree line at the edge of the archery range, face more visible now, hands at his sides. I went back through every photograph, all 31 of them, the lake, the talent show stage, the hiking trail, the craft cabin, the boys' cabin row. He was in 23 of them, sometimes at the edge of a shot, sometimes much closer than that. And the locations made no logical sequence. There was no way one person could have been in the positions this man occupied across consecutive photos unless they were moving specifically to stay in frame. Photo 14 was taken at the waterfront. Photo 15, which my mother had labeled as the same afternoon, was taken at the craft's cabin 200 yards away. In photo 14, he was on the dock. In photo 15, he was behind the window of the craft's cabin, face visible between 2 children working at the same table. There is no path between those 2 locations that someone could cover in the time it takes to snap 2 photographs at a summer afternoon activity. I laid the photos out in chronological order, using the dates my mother had penciled on the backs. I looked at them as a sequence. The man got closer as the summer went on, not dramatically, not in a way that would have been legible in any individual photo, but as a progression. July, then late July, then the first week of August. The distance between him and the nearest child in each frame decreased. Steadily, deliberately. The kind of decrease that looks like nothing until you see all 31 photos in a row on a kitchen table at 3 in the morning. I told myself there was an explanation, a parent on visiting day, a groundskeeper who happened to be everywhere. I was 30 years and half a night of bad sleep away from 1993, and heat does things to your reasoning before sunrise. The explanation didn't come. Camp Wendell closed in 2001. I found that with a quick search. The director, a man named Gerald Puel, had died in 2009. I found an alumni Facebook group with about 60 members and posted a careful, low-key message. Does anyone remember a staff member or regular presence from the 1993 season? Older man, light-colored shirts, often near the perimeter of activities. Nobody responded for 2 days. I went back to the photos in the meantime. I started a separate folder on my desktop, scanned each one, and zoomed into the backgrounds in a way I hadn't been able to do with the physical prints on the garage floor. The additional resolution didn't help. It confirmed what I'd already seen and gave me worse versions of the moments I'd been trying to rationalize away. In the close-up of the talent show photo, where I'd assumed he was partially behind a set piece, there was nothing behind him at all. He was in the open. Nobody in the foreground was looking at him. Nobody was looking at him in any of the 23 photos. 23 separate moments across 6 weeks, and not a single camper or counselor with their attention turned his way. I started trying to remember him and couldn't. 6 weeks of my own life and no memory of this face. Then Danny Harriet, the same Danny from the candid photo, messaged me privately and asked me to call him instead of posting further. I called him that night. He picked up on the second ring, like he'd been sitting with his phone. Danny said he'd thought about that summer for 30 years. He said there had been a man, not a counselor and not a parent. Someone the staff referred to as the caretaker when campers asked, always with a vague explanation about groundskeeping. Danny said he'd told a counselor when the man stood outside the cabin window 2 nights in a row. The counselor told the director. His parents were called and informed that Danny was homesick and having nightmares. He was 9 years old. He believed them. Danny said the thing that had stayed with him, the thing that kept the memory alive all these years rather than letting it soften into something manageable, was that the morning after he'd reported the man, the camp director came to breakfast and made an announcement about keeping the cabin windows closed at night due to mosquitoes. No other explanation. New rule, effective immediately. The kind of institutional non-answer that a child accepts because they don't yet know that institutions lie. After we got off the phone, I opened a Catskill newspaper archive and started searching. It took the better part of an hour. What I found was a 1997 article about a man named Dennis Volk, arrested for predatory behavior at a summer program in Sullivan County, 2 camps over from Wendell. In the article, a source described Volk as having been quietly removed from several camp properties in the region throughout the late 80s and early 90s. No charges had been filed at those earlier locations. Camp Wendell was named specifically in the account. The year given was 1993. Dennis Volk was convicted in 1998. He was released in 2011. I sat with that information for a long time. I went back through the photos one last time. I'd been focused on the backgrounds, tree lines, distances, the architectural logic of his positions across shots. I'd looked at every edge of every photograph. I hadn't looked at the water. There was a lake shot from the final week of camp. 8 or 9 of us in the shallows, waist deep, splashing and making faces at the camera the way 9-year-olds do. I remembered that afternoon. It had felt like a good memory. Late July heat, cool water, the whole summer still feeling infinite, even as it was ending. He was standing 8 feet behind me, waist deep in the lake. His right hand was extended toward my left shoulder, not touching, close enough to... None of the other children in the photo were looking at him. No one on the dock was looking at him. The counselor with the camera was not looking at him. I have no memory of anyone being near me in the water that afternoon. I'm writing this because 4 days ago, someone commented on a buried post in the Camp Wendell alumni group. Someone asking if anyone had old photos to share, posted back in 2022. The comment was recent. 3 sentences, friendly, mentioning the summer of '93 specifically. The account had no profile photo, no friends listed, created 6 months ago. The name was Dennis V. I reported the account. I called the county sheriff's office in the jurisdiction where the camp used to operate and left a message. I scanned the photos and sent copies to Danny.
I haven't heard back from anyone yet.
If you attended Camp Wendell between 1991 and 1994, I want you to find your photos. Look at the edges of the frame. Look at the backgrounds. Look at the water. Tell me what you see. Tell me I'm wrong about this. I really want to be wrong. My husband has always been a restless sleeper. I want to establish that up front, because everything that followed has a context, and without it, you're going to draw the wrong conclusion before I've even started. Marcus runs warm, always has. In winter, he sleeps with one leg outside the covers. In summer, before we got central air, he'd wander the house at night. Kitchen for water, back porch for the breeze, once just the basement to stand on the cool concrete for a few minutes. I'd hear him sometimes, going door to door in the dark. Always quiet, always back in bed by the time I drifted off again. I called it sleepwalking. He didn't love that word. He knew he was awake, he said, just restless. But we'd been together 11 years, and the pattern was familiar enough that I'd stopped registering it. He wandered. That was Marcus. We moved into the house on Callaway Street in May. Older home, good bones, no central air. We bought 2 window units, one for the bedroom, one for the living room, and assumed that would be enough. It wasn't enough. Not that July. The unit in the bedroom gave out the first week of August, and 2 weeks later we were still waiting on the replacement part, and the nights were brutal. Box fan in the window, damp towels, sliding door to the backyard cracked open, and me sleeping in 40-minute intervals. Waking up too hot, drifting back, waking up again. That's when I started noticing. The first night I woke at 2 and Marcus wasn't in bed. I lay there for a few minutes, heard nothing, fell back asleep. Normal. The second night I woke at 1:40 and heard him in the hallway. I called his name. He said, "Yeah," quiet, like he didn't want to wake me, and a minute later he came back to bed. I noticed he lay down on my side first, then seemed to reconsider, and moved to his own. I was half asleep. I filed it as nothing. The third night I woke at 2:30 and he wasn't in the room. I got up. I found him in the kitchen, standing at the counter with both hands flat on the surface, facing the wall. Not the window, the wall. I asked what he was doing, and there was a pause, a half beat too long, before he turned around and said he'd been getting water. There was no glass on the counter, nothing in the sink. I told myself he'd been half asleep on his feet, that he hadn't actually gotten the water yet. The pause was just the gap between a dream and waking. I went back to bed, but I lay there thinking about the pause, replaying it. It wasn't the pause of a man waking up. It was the pause of a man deciding something. The fourth night, the back porch. Standing at the railing, facing the yard, completely still. I watched him from the doorway for 3 minutes before I said his name, and he turned around and smiled at me and said he was just getting some air. The smile was fine. Everything about it was fine. I don't know how to explain why it made the hair on my arms stand up, except to say I have been looking at that man's face for 11 years, and I know what his real smile looks like, and that wasn't it. I started paying attention to small things after that. He called me by my full name. Not my nickname, which is what he's called me since the first month we were together. My full name, friendly, natural, in a sentence, as if he'd always done it. I mentioned it casually, "You've been calling me Renata all week," and he laughed and said he hadn't realized. He didn't go back to the nickname. He smelled different. Nothing dramatic. A slight wrongness underneath his usual scent, like something left in standing water. He had a habit of always looking out the passenger side window when we drove. He stopped doing it, started looking straight ahead, or at me. Each thing alone was explainable. Together, at 2 in the morning, adding them up while sweat tracked down my spine and the fan moved hot air from one side of the room to the other, together they formed something I didn't have a word for yet. The 6th night, I followed him. I'd been awake since 1, watching the ceiling, waiting. At 2:15 he got up. He moved through the dark house the way he always did. Slow, no lights, quiet, in a way that had always seemed considerate and now seemed practiced. I gave him 30 seconds and then got up. He went to the basement door. I stood at the top of the stairs and watched him go down. I didn't follow past the landing. I just watched. He crossed the basement to the far wall. Concrete block, bare, no shelves, nothing there, and he stood in front of it, with his back to me. He stood there for 41 minutes. I timed it on my phone. He didn't move, didn't fidget, didn't scratch his arm or shift his weight. He stood in front of a blank wall in a dark basement at 2 in the morning, like he was waiting for something to happen on the other side of it.
I went back to bed before he came upstairs.
I lay there and thought about the conversation I'd have with him in the morning. The longer I thought about it, the less certain I became about what I would say. And then I thought about something else, something I'd been not looking at directly. I called it sleepwalking. That's what I said at the beginning of this, that Marcus had always been a restless sleeper who wandered the house at night, and I had always called it sleepwalking. But I went back through 11 years of memories looking for a specific one. A night I'd actually watched him wander, a morning he'd woken up not remembering being in the kitchen, and I couldn't find it. I kept generating scenarios that felt like memories and then dissolving them when I looked too closely. They weren't there. What I found instead was a morning 3 weeks after we moved in, June, before the heat got bad. I'd woken up early and come downstairs and found Marcus standing in the kitchen, and something about the way he was standing had made me feel cold, and I had stood in the doorway for a long moment before he noticed me and turned around. I had told myself it was sleepwalking right then, in that doorway, as a way of explaining what I was seeing, as a way of not having to look at what it actually looked like. That night, when he finally turned around in the basement, I wasn't there to see it. I'd been careful. I'd been quiet going back up the stairs. But in the morning, he came up from the basement while I was making coffee, and he looked at me across the kitchen, and he said,
I thought I heard you on the stairs last night.
And he smiled. We sold the house. We're renting an apartment now, 4th floor, and Marcus says the elevation makes the heat more bearable. He's sleeping through the night again. No wandering. 2 nights ago, I woke up at 2 in the morning, hot. I lay there and I noticed he wasn't breathing the way he normally breathes in sleep, that particular slow rhythm I've memorized over 11 years. And I thought about checking, and I didn't. I'm not posting this for advice. I don't think there's anything to do. I'm posting it because I've been awake since 2, and I needed to put it somewhere outside my own head. If anyone has experienced something like this, a partner who changes in summer heat, small things first, and then larger ones, I'd really like to hear from you. I'm trying to figure out whether I'm describing something that has a name. I've lived in Sycamore Glen for 4 years, and I want to be honest, I have never once read the full HOA document. I know where to find it. I've glanced at the first 3 sections, which cover fence heights and paint approval and the ban on street parking between midnight and 6. I skim for the parts that apply to me and close the PDF. That's how most people interact with their HOA documents. That's normal. What's not normal is reading the whole thing at 2 in the morning because you can't sleep and you got a push notification. Let me back up. August, last summer, brutal heat wave. One of those weeks where the temperature drops to 84 at midnight and everyone sleeps on top of their covers and quietly hates each other. I'd been awake since 1. At 2 o'clock, my phone buzzed on the nightstand with a notification from the HOA app, which I had genuinely forgotten sent notifications. It was a reminder. Summer night ordinance. Residents are reminded that Sycamore Glen's summer night protocols are in effect June through August. Full documentation available in your resident portal. I don't know why I clicked through. Boredom. Heat-addled curiosity. The particular bad judgment that lives in the hours between 2 and 4 a.m. I told myself I'd read for 10 minutes and then try to sleep again. The first 6 sections were exactly what I expected. No outdoor amplified music after 10 p.m. Fire pits prohibited from June 1st through September 1st. Pool access ends at 9. Don't leave trash receptacles at the curb more than 12 hours after scheduled pickup. Lawn height not to exceed 4 inches. Satellite dishes must be mounted at the rear of the property. Normal. Boring. Exactly the document you'd expect from a planned community built in 1987. Section 7 was different. The heading read, Seasonal Evening Protocols, Retention Pond Area. June to August, 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. I almost kept scrolling. Then I read the first line. Between the hours of 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., from June 1st through August 31st, no resident should acknowledge or respond to sounds originating from the retention pond area, regardless of the apparent nature of those sounds. I sat up. I read it again. Then I read the next rule. Exterior lighting oriented toward the north property boundary, retention pond side, should not be activated during this period. This includes porch lights, floodlights, security lighting, and handheld illumination devices. Then, the north access gate should remain locked during this period. Do not attempt to open the gate, regardless of what you may observe near or beyond it. And then the one that made me get out of bed entirely. If you observe an individual or individuals near the retention pond during this period, do not approach, do not call out, and do not contact emergency services. Return to your home and remain inside until 4 a.m. I was standing in my living room now, phone in hand. The house was quiet except for the box fan in the window. I could hear faintly through the sliding door I'd left cracked for the breeze, the sound of the retention pond. It was making a sound I didn't have a word for. I went back to the beginning of Section 7 and read it straight through a second time. There were 11 sub-rules in total. Taken individually, each one could almost be explained away. Noise concerns, liability, light pollution compliance, liability again. Taken together, in sequence, they read like instructions for surviving something specific. Don't listen. Don't look. Don't open the gate. Don't call for help. Stay inside until it's over. I pulled up the document metadata. The original HOA covenant had been filed in 1987 when Sycamore Glen was first built. Section 7 had been added as an amendment in the summer of 1989, 2 years after the community opened. I thought about what might have happened in those 2 years that would cause a homeowners association to quietly amend their founding document with 11 rules about a retention pond. I started searching. Property records, news archives, anything with Sycamore Glen and a date between 1987 and 1995. I found one item, a brief notice in a local paper from August 1989, the kind of thing that runs in the community calendar section, 4 lines. It said that a resident of Sycamore Glen, name withheld, had been hospitalized following what was described as an incident at the North Retention Pond. No further details given. The notice ran once and didn't appear again. I searched for the hospitalized resident. I tried every combination of Sycamore Glen and Pond and 1989 and hospitalized I could think of. Nothing. Whoever it was had either recovered quietly or been recovered quietly, and either way someone had made sure it didn't generate a second article. The Section 7 amendment was filed the following month. I want to tell you I went back to bed at this point, that I closed the app, put my phone face down, and made the rational choice. Instead, I went to the sliding door. I didn't go outside. I want to be clear about that. I stood in the doorway, behind the screen, and I looked north toward the retention pond. There are no lights near the pond. The streetlights on that side of the development are spaced too far apart, and the north fence line sits in full shadow after 10 p.m. I couldn't see much. The water catches some ambient light when conditions are right, and that night I could make out just the far edge of it, a faint, still sheen in the dark. Something was standing at the edge of the water. I say something because I registered it as a shape before I registered it as anything else. A vertical shape, still, standing in the place where the fence line meets the water at the north gate, which I had just read should remain locked. The shape wasn't moving. It was facing the houses, facing my house, the way it was oriented, or the way I believed it was oriented, in the dark from 30 yards away through a screen door, suggested it was looking directly at the door I was standing in. I stepped back. I pulled the screen shut. I stood in the middle of my living room and did not turn on any lights, and I did not go outside, and I did not call anyone. At 4:15 in the morning, I went to the door and looked again. The pond was empty. The gate was closed. I've been sleeping better since the heat broke. The nights are cooler, and I'm not waking at 1 and lying there cataloging every sound the house makes. That helps. What doesn't help is that I went back to the HOA portal 2 weeks after that night to pull up Section 7 and send a screenshot to my neighbor Craig, who's lived here longer than I have and would probably find the whole thing grimly funny.
The current version of the document ends at Section 6.
I checked the county assessor's office filing records. The 1989 amendment is still registered. It just isn't in the document anymore. My neighbor Karen has lived in Sycamore Glen since it opened, since 1987. She came over for coffee last week. I brought it up as casually as I could manage, mentioned I'd been reading through the HOA docs, and there seemed to be a section missing from the current version. She set her mug down. She looked at me for a moment before she answered. Then she said, "Most people don't stay up late enough to need that section anymore." She changed the subject, and we didn't go back to it. I've been thinking about that sentence every night since. What she meant by anymore. What changed? Whether the change was in the people or in something else. Last Saturday, I set an alarm for 2 a.m. I stood at the sliding door and I looked toward the north fence. I'm not going to tell you what I saw. I don't have the right words for it yet, and I think if I say it wrong, it won't sound like what it was. What I'll tell you is this. If you live in a planned development built in the late 80s, find the full HOA document, not the summary version they link from the front page. The full document, with amendments. Read what they added in the second year and ask yourself why the first year wasn't enough. And if you find a section that only applies between 2 and 4 a.m., in summer, near a body of water, don't read it at night. Read it in the morning when you can still tell yourself there's an explanation. If something spooky has ever happened to you, or if you've got a story you want to share, send it in to stories@silasdarkwood.com. If you're still with me, there's another set of creepy stories on your screen, just waiting to give you another chill.